So now we're going to talk about laws, theories, and hypotheses. So overview of today's agenda, we'll spend some time talking about laws, theories, and hypotheses, and then we'll play a card game, and then I'll tell you what to study for next class. So take out a piece of paper and very quickly write down 3 laws in physics. So stop the video, take a moment, write down 3 laws in physics. Should be relatively easy, especially if you've taken physics in high school. So if you did this task, you probably come up with things like the law of motion, law of gravity, law of thermodynamics, or the law of relativity. Those are all very valid laws in physics. Um, so great. I figure most of you aren't physics majors, or probably none of you are physics majors. So let's something a little bit simpler. Write down 3 laws in psychology. So again, pause the video, take a minute, write down 3 laws in psychology. It's not as easy as it sounds, is it? So it's probably relatively easy for you to think of at least 1 or 2 laws in physics, or even if you couldn't think of any, you probably could recall some once you heard me state them. You're like, oh yeah, I know the law of relativity. Um, but you probably didn't think of very many or any laws in psychology. That's because there are no laws in psychology. As of today, there aren't anything that we would consider to be a law in psychology, whereas in other disciplines, there are clear laws that have been established over centuries. So that raises the question, what is a law? So let's take a moment and let's backtrack and let's define what a law is. So laws are universal principles that demonstrate or describe a phenomenon. So you can think of the law of gravity, right? So that's a principle that you can use to explain why things fall when they're on Earth and why things don't fall in space, right? Because gravity works on Earth but not in space. So these are principles that we can use to determine when certain things will happen. So you can be very confident now that if you drop an apple here on Earth, that it will fall. And I give you another example of Newton's second law of motion. Again, this is not a physics class, so I'm not going to test you on this. But if you wanted to get an understanding of that particular principle, I briefly describe it here, and then I give you a video that you can use to get more insights. But for now, what I want you to remember is what a law is. And the key here is that laws are universal. So they hold true in pretty much all contexts. So while psychology doesn't have any laws, we have a ton of theories, right? And a theory is an interrelated set of principles that attempt to explain why something happens. So there's various theories that kind of explain phenomenon. And the key thing to remember about a theory that theories are conditional. So unlike laws that are universal, they hold in some contexts, but not in other contexts. And I'll give you an example of a theory in a moment. But the key here is to remember that theories don't always hold true. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of a good theory. One is that it should be general enough that it can explain multiple outcomes. And again, we'll talk about a theory in a minute. It should be falsifiable. We talked about that earlier. It has to be able to be tested so that you can see that either the data supports or doesn't support that particular theory. You should be able to predict new outcomes based upon your hypothesis, and it should be parsimonious. And we talked about that before, where you want to use the simplest possible number of assumptions to explain a phenomenon. So let's get an example of a theory, and this one comes from social psychology, social identity theory. It's a relatively popular theory in social psychology that was established in the 1970s. And one of the main kind of principles of this theory is that people are motivated to maintain their self-esteem. And the theory argues that self-esteem is based upon 2 primary things: a person's personal identity and their various social identities. So as I visualize here, you have someone's self-esteem, and it's partly derived from their personal identity, so me as an individual, but also from my social identity, so me as being a male or being a professor or being a black person. Those are all my social identities, and they also impact my self-esteem. So hang on to that theory for a minute. We're going to come back to it. The last thing I want to talk about are hypotheses. Hypotheses propose specific, and of course, that's very important, falsifiable relationships between two or more variables. So you're saying there is a positive correlation between X and Y, or X is going to have an effect on Y. That's more of a causal hypothesis, right? And what I want you to remember about hypotheses is that they're typically derived from a theory, and they're used to test the validity of that theory. So let's go back to social identity theory. So one hypothesis that people developed from social identity theory was this idea that if one's personal self-esteem is threatened in some way, they're going to be motivated to use their group identity as a way to make themselves feel better. So if I tell you that you failed your first exam, you might be then more inclined to place more emphasis on your social identities because your personality has been threatened. You've been told that you did not do well on that particular exam. So maybe you'll place more of an emphasis on one of your social identities. And one way to make your social identities as positive as possible is by denigrating outgroup members. So let's say I focus on my identity as, I don't know, a New Yorker. I might then look down on people from New Jersey and be like, oh, New Jersey people suck, they're terrible, right? So by denigrating New Jersey, I make myself feel better as a New Yorker, which then protects myself from the negative effects of failing that particular exam. So the negative effects of having my personal identity threatened. So as you can see here, this is an hypothesis that you can go out and test. And they've done multiple tests on this particular hypothesis. And they show that if someone's personal identity has been threatened, they'll then rely on their social identities to protect themselves, and they'll denigrate outgroups to make their social group look better, which in turn makes them feel better about themselves. So what I want you to remember from this is that obviously what laws, theories, and hypotheses are, and that one of the goals in science is to be able to establish laws. And laws are difficult to establish, especially in the social sciences, because people are very complex, and it's not always that people act in consistent ways. What I also want you to remember is that laws and theories cannot be directly tested. So as a result, researchers develop hypotheses that are derived from the theory that they then can use to test the theory. So they'll develop hypotheses, test those hypotheses by collecting data, which is empiricism, and then based upon the results of that study, they'll then say that the data either supports or refutes their hypothesis, which then would either support or refute the theory from which the hypothesis was derived. But the thing you need to remember is you never directly test a theory, you always indirectly test a theory based upon the hypotheses that you developed from that theory. Just to visualize again, there are very few laws, there are many theories, and then there are many, many more hypotheses that are derived from those theories. So once you develop an hypothesis based upon a theory, you have to go out and collect data to test that particular hypothesis. So the question then becomes, how do you know if your data supports your hypothesis? So what I want us to do is I want us to play a card game. So I want you to take out a piece of paper and write down EK, 4, and 7. So these are going to be 4 cards, EK, 4, and 7, and each card is a letter on one side and a number on the other side. Okay, so just recognize that if there's a letter on one side, there's a number on the other side. Again, the key here is to write down EK, 4, and 7. Now, I have an hypothesis that every card containing a vowel must have an even number on the other side. Now, what I want you to try to do is I want you to figure out the minimum numbers of cards and which specific cards that you have to turn over to accurately test my hypothesis. Okay, so you need to tell me exactly which cards you need to turn over, and I only want the minimum number. If you only requires two numbers that need to be turned over, two cards that need to be turned over, then tell me those two cards. If it requires all four cards, then state all four cards. But the idea here is give me the minimum number of cards and which specific cards need to be turned over to test my hypothesis. So, again, my hypothesis is that every card containing a vowel must have an even number on the other side. So I would suggest that you pause the video for a minute and think about which cards you need to turn over to be able to test my hypothesis. Okay, so hopefully you took a moment and you tried to figure out the answer to this question, because I'm hoping to be able to drive home an important principle. So hopefully well, think about it like this. Picking E allows you to disconfirm the hypothesis, right? So picking E allows you to disconfirm my hypothesis. Because if you pick E and turn it over and you have an odd number, that would disconfirm the hypothesis. You definitely need to have E. Turning over K doesn't tell you anything because the hypothesis has nothing to do about constants, so it doesn't really matter what happens with K. And 4 doesn't really matter either. The hypothesis can be true regardless of whether it has a vowel or a consonant on it, on the other side. Picking 7, though, it also enables you to disconfirm the hypothesis, right? So E and 7 enable you to disconfirm, while K and 4 don't really provide you any evidence of disconfirmation. They can provide support that it is correct, but it can't show that it's not correct. So what I want you to think about is this idea of confirmation bias, in that people tend to look for evidence that confirms what they are trying to test instead of focusing on trying to find evidence that would enable them to disconfirm what they're testing. Right? So it's a little bit counterintuitive. The goal here is to be able to open up your hypothesis to be able to be disconfirmed, and E and 7 are the cards that would enable you to be able to disconfirm the hypothesis. That's why E and 7 are the correct cards to turn over. So that gets us to this idea of disconfirmation, or oftentimes called falsification. When researchers try to test a theory, they can never prove that it's true. So whenever you are writing a paper, never say the data proves my theory or proves my hypothesis. Just say that the data either supports or doesn't support the hypothesis, because you can't make any firm conclusions based upon one study. So the data can't prove a theory to be true, but it can provide evidence that it's unlikely to be true. So your goal really is to open up your theory to being disconfirmed and hope that it ultimately doesn't get disconfirmed. And theories that are unable to be disconfirmed ultimately are accepted as being likely to be true. Theories that end up being disconfirmed are either discarded or modified. So again, if you get evidence that supports your hypothesis or your theory, you can't say that now that theory, that hypothesis is true. Just you can say that it's been supported by the data, because you can get new data that might ultimately disconfirm that theory or that hypothesis. And again, your goal here is to continue to collect data that doesn't disconfirm the hypothesis.